So welcome, everybody. It's great to have you in class today. Today, we're going to dive deep into the 14th Amendment and look at the writing of the 14th Amendment all the way through to modern cases and how the interpretation of the 14th Amendment affects us today. My name is Kerry Sautner, and I'll be with you during this class. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A. I'll check both places, and we're here to help. So please, we love questions, all questions. This session is being recorded and live streamed. And we're also here with one of our top scholars at the Constitution Center, Tom Donnelly. Tom, would you like to say hi to everybody?
Hi, I'm Tom Donnelly. I am the Senior Fellow for Constitutional Studies here at the Constitution Center, and can't wait to dig into the history of equality and the 14th Amendment with you today.
I'm so excited, Tom. 14th Amendment is huge. It is referenced all the time. And so it is such a powerful thing to go through and make sure that our students have an understanding of the big ideas in the 14th Amendment, why it was written in the first place, what was going on in our country that the 14th Amendment was needed, and then how it has been utilized by Congress and by the people over time, and also how it has not been utilized at times. So can't wait to dive in. I'm gonna guess you want to start with the text.
Of course, Kerry. Let's begin with the text. That's the way to go. And so, here, it's a big wall of text. I don't want you to be too intimidated. And Kerry, if you could maybe flash to the other sections too, just to give people a sense. This is the longest set of constitutional texts we're adding after the founding, but it's worth reading that section 1 as a whole because it may be the most important part of the Constitution. So here we go. I will read it as clearly as possible. Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Now that's a mouthful, but it's such powerful, powerful language. And the thing to keep in mind is that this language is at the core of almost every big debate we say today over constitutional issues. Almost every big Supreme Court case you care about turns on this language. So affirmative action, same-sex marriage, reproductive rights, privacy, even cases that you may think of as Bill of Rights cases, cases dealing with free speech, religious liberty, if they have to do with state laws or state actions, they're 14th Amendment cases. And so I just wanted to sort of pause there. It's a huge deal, and you can almost tell the history of the modern Supreme Court as a story of the modern day debates over the 14th Amendment's meaning. So you literally can't overestimate just how important this text is. Maybe just to flash forward to section 5, Kerry, maybe we should read that one too, just to preview one final part of this, which is, this is section 5, the Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. So again, there we're seeing Congress being given new powers. And so if we're taking all of that text together and we want to package it into what are the 4 big ideas, the 4 big things that we were trying to write into the Constitution with the 14th Amendment, let's go through them. Let's tick through them quickly and then get into the stories of the history. So the 4 big features, the first one is birthright citizenship. And so the idea here is that Dred Scott v. Sanford is overturned. African Americans do have rights which the white man is bound to respect. And if you're born on American soil, you're a United States citizen. So that's birthright citizenship. Number 2, the protection of equality. Remember, the 1787 Constitution was silent on the issue of equality. With the 14th Amendment, we finally write the Declaration of Independence's promise of equality, that all men and eventually all women are created equal, right there into the Constitution. Equality is now in there. It's the unity in that sense of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, the Declaration being brought into the Constitution. So birthright citizenship, equality. The third big idea is freedom. What do we mean by that? What do we mean by freedom in this context? Well, remember, when we added the Bill of Rights to the Constitution at the founding, it only applied to the national government. And so with the 14th Amendment, what we're doing is we're saying those Bill of Rights, those key Bill of Rights protections like free speech, religious liberty, we're going to apply them to the states. Before the Civil War, Southern states wound up attacking these very rights, speech, religious liberty, things like that, to attack anti-slavery and abolitionist speech. And right now we're saying, now under the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, free speech, religious liberty, we're applying it to state abuses. So birthright citizenship. Yes, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, can you just, because it's our like higher level class, can you just take a nod to incorporation around applying those freedoms of the Bill of Rights? I think of the 14th Amendment as the sticking amendment. It takes the Bill of Rights and it sticks the Bill of Rights to the individual and says no state, no local, and no federal government can step on these freedoms. But can you explain what that means when the students hear the words like incorporation?
Sure.
And then we'll get to that last part.
Yeah, no, not at all. And incorporation is just the fancy way that lawyers say exactly what Kerry just said, which is that now, the Bill of Rights only applies to the national government. Now those Bill of Rights protections are going to stick to you in the states. So for instance, I'm in New Jersey. Before the 14th Amendment, I could be thrown in jail for criticizing my governor or my state legislature, and I wouldn't be able to use the First Amendment to attack those wrongs. After the 14th Amendment, I can. And that's what we mean by incorporation. And the way that it worked over time was, rather than saying in one fell swoop, the entire Bill of Rights is incorporated against the states, what we've done is on a case-by-case basis, starting in 1925, really, I would say, with free speech and free press, onward all the way up into the 50s, 60s, we've sort of right by right, incorporated right by right, as to where now, and we were still doing it this year in a case called Ramos. We said, a unanimous jury right, that applies to the federal government in the states. We hadn't said that before. Only 3 rights that I can think of have not been incorporated yet. The Third Amendment, which is about the quartering of soldiers in people's houses. The Fifth Amendment's grand jury right, and the Seventh Amendment civil jury right. But this is just, again, the way my old teacher, Akil Amar, said it is just like almost any Bill of Rights case you think about is really a 14th Amendment case because they almost always have to do with the states.
And I think it's a fascinating way to look at it, and literally incorporating it, weaving in the Bill of Rights into all sections of the individual's rights. So that last section, that section 5 that we highlighted, that section 5, Congress is given more power. That's actually in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And so, and Colin had a great question in here, but can you tell us a little bit about it? And then I'm going to ping to Colin's question.
No, that's perfect. And so, this last one, that's section 5, where we're saying Congress shall have the power in the context of the 14th Amendment to pass laws that are advancing the rights in the 14th Amendment. But across those 3 amendments, we're seeing Congress having more power. And this is a change in the American constitutional story. Remember, when we put the Bill of Rights into the Constitution, it was Congress shall make no law. The national government its powers are being reduced. We're skeptical of the national government having too much power. But with the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, what we're doing is we're looking at the Civil War. We're seeing that states can do a lot of wrong too. And we're rebalancing that power between the national government and the states, for the first time giving Congress more power than it had at the founding, power to abolish slavery, power to promote freedom and equality, and power to end racial discrimination in voting. And so again, the last point, the 14th Amendment, the Reconstruction amendments, that story, it's a federalism story too. It's about which powers go to the national government, which to the states, and how does that shift over time?
Yeah, and I love that. So thinking about, like, in the beginning, during the Constitutional Convention, we're super worried about the federal government. We're paranoid that they're going to have too much power, so we put restrictions on them. And now we realize over time, we shift that power and say, no, we want the federal government to step in and help and protect the individual and not the states. So it goes back and forth. And it's just always, with everything we talk about, is how do we balance it to the right level? So Colin's question earlier, which I love, and it's the exact same question I asked you in last class, was, so Congress is given the power in these amendments. 13th ends slavery, 14th is equality and freedom, birthright citizenship, 15th is voting rights for African-American males. Congress is given the power. Do they use it? It's a power and a duty. And do they use it right away? Do they not use it over time? That's really, even though you're given the power, doesn't mean you're applying the power. So tell us that story of the 14th Amendment.
Of course, yeah. It's an interesting story, and it's a great question, because it ends up being sort of a rise and a fall and a rise again, if what you're looking at is the promise of the Reconstruction amendments. And the first thing to say is, we really did experiment in interracial democracy during Reconstruction. We really did have African Americans in the Senate, U.S. House of Representatives, as governors, as state legislators, as sheriffs, all the way up and down. And so there was a degree to which we really did try to realize the promise of the Declaration of Independence in our governments and tried to make good on the promise of the Reconstruction amendments. Congress did too. Congress passed laws that attacked white violence against African Americans, that attacked attempts to keep African Americans from the vote. And so there was, especially if you're looking at sort of the late 1860s, early 1870s, things like the Ku Klux Klan Act, things like the Military Reconstruction Acts. These are attempts to truly reconstruct the South and to rebalance political power in the South away from the ex-Confederate white Southerners, the plantation class, towards African Americans and their white Republican allies. We really tried to create a two-party system and governments that have both whites and African Americans at their core. What we end up seeing, though, is, the election of 1874 is a key moment where Democrats, so the party of the white Southerners, reclaim power in the House of Representatives. They take back control of the House of Representatives. What we see over time is a move away from this attempt at interracial democracy. We see white Southerners retake power in the South. And then we see a series of Supreme Court decisions making it more and more difficult to enforce national rights, to, whether it's something like the slaughterhouse cases, which was the first big case under the 14th Amendment in 1873, which I'm not going to go into the details of, but I mean, effectively what it did was, the Reconstruction framers cared a lot about the 14th Amendment's promotion of freedom. They thought it would be enforced under what's called the Privileges or Immunities Clause. And with the slaughterhouse cases, what the Supreme Court did was it read that power really, really narrowly. And it's a really close, remember, it's a really close case. It's a 5-4 decision. The decisive justice there is Justice Nathan Clifford, who's a holdover from the Buchanan administration. He was a Buchanan appointee. But the Republican justices divide, the Republican appointed justices divide 4-4. And what the majority says, it ends up being a debate about federalism. And what the majority says is that we can't read the powers of the 14th Amendment too broadly because we're afraid that it's going to too fundamentally transform our constitutional system. It's going to take away the traditional powers of the states. It's going to take away all of the things we value about federalism. And it's going to put all of that power in the national government. Now, remember, who wrote this opinion? It's Justice Samuel Freeman Miller, who's a Lincoln appointee. He's an old Whig Republican. And part of what he's thinking about is, what's the law at issue in slaughterhouse cases? It's a law that's passed by a biracial legislature in Louisiana. So part of what you're gaining from the police power, from those traditional powers of the states to pass laws for the health, safety, and welfare of their citizens is the power to let Reconstruction work in the South while they have political power. So it ends up being a really hard question where on the one hand, the majority is saying the states need power so Reconstruction can work, so these Reconstruction legislatures can work. And you have the dissenters saying, no, the 14th Amendment meant what it says. It meant what the framers said. It really meant to fundamentally transform our system. We need to lock those benefits in place in the Constitution. And part of that is to be able to use the 14th Amendment to attack state laws that go against fundamental rights, whether it's key Bill of Rights protections like free speech and religious liberty, or whether it's what was at issue in the slaughterhouse cases, which was an unenumerated, unwritten right about the right to carry on a profession of your choosing. And so it's a very, and I'll just end in this because obviously I don't want to go on for too long about slaughterhouse, but this was a real debate in the Republican Party in the 1860s and especially the 1870s, which was how much to federalism, how much to the states, and how much new power to the national government.
And Jeff did ask the question in here was, do you think that the founding fathers would have worried about that extra power they put in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment? I did nod to the fact that Madison did attempt to write an early version of the 14th Amendment, but I can definitely see that all that extra power for Congress would make many of the founding fathers a little uncomfortable, especially back then.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, some of the nationalists like Madison, like Wilson, wanted Congress to have a veto over state laws. So Congress being able to just strike out state laws. And then you're right, Madison, when he put together the Bill of Rights, had something in there protecting free speech, conscience, the jury right, and effectively incorporated those protections against the states. But, anytime you're rebalancing national and state power, it would make most people who care about the Constitution nervous because you're changing big things. You may be changing it for the right reason, that it may be a good, but it's something you do very carefully.
Yeah, and unintended consequences can always be very interesting. So let's jump to Plessy v. Ferguson. Slaughterhouse is an amazing case we need to look at closely and realize how it kind of weakened parts of the 14th Amendment. Do you want to talk about John Bingham first before we go to Plessy, Tom?
I can, you know what, I'll use Bingham. So one of the questions, so Plessy v. Ferguson, let me put the facts on the table, and then we can rewind briefly to Bingham. So Plessy v. Ferguson is about the constitutionality of a Jim Crow segregation law in Louisiana. The law that is issued there is on railway cars in Louisiana, Louisiana is saying that those railway operators have to provide different cars for white passengers and African-American passengers. And so, what happens here is, who is Homer Plessy? Well, Homer Plessy is, he's part of a committee of concerned citizens who believe that this new law it goes against, one, the 14th Amendment's promise of equality and the Equal Protection Clause, and two, it goes against the very project of government that you've seen in Louisiana since the Civil War. Louisiana was one of those places where you had interracial legislatures, you had Reconstruction laws passed to promise equality, and what they're seeing here is just over 2 decades after the ratification of the 14th Amendment. So 14th Amendment ratified in 1868, this Louisiana law is 1890. You're already seeing a strike back against that promise of equality, and Homer Plessy saying, I'm going to lay claim to the 14th Amendment, say this is unconstitutional. Plessy himself was an African-American. He was a free African-American. The reason he was chosen, this was a test case where the committee wanted to challenge this law. Homer Plessy said, I will be the person to break it. And they chose him because he was a light-skinned African-American. It was hard to even know whether he was white or African-American. And so they were trying to emphasize how ridiculous and arbitrary the Louisiana law was. And so what's the key text that they're relying on in the Constitution? You can never read it too often. It's the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which says that no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And so this text, the author of this text is John Bingham, who was a representative. He was in the U.S. House of Representatives from the state of Ohio. He was on a committee called the Joint Committee on Reconstruction, which the Reconstruction Congress put in place in December of 1865 to study what's going on in the South after the Civil War and to suggest what can we do to make sure post-Civil War America is better than pre-Civil War America? What's the best that we can do to make sure that the Civil War was worth it? And so scholar Gerard Magliocca referred to the Joint Committee on Reconstruction as a second constitutional convention. And it's the Joint Committee that's responsible for the 14th Amendment and Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, which we read at the beginning. The primary author of Section 1 is this man, John Bingham, who the great Hugo Black, the Justice Hugo Black, justice in the 20th century, referred to as the 14th Amendment's James Madison. And so if you think of Madison as the father of the Constitution, John Bingham's the father of the 14th Amendment. And what did Bingham say about the promise of equality in the amendment? Well, here's a speech he gave. He's running for re-election in 1866. It's funny to think of him as just another politician in the middle of midterm elections. Congress just approved the 14th Amendment in June of 1866. And John Bingham is on the campaign trail stumping on behalf of the 14th Amendment. And he said, someone asked, so Mr. Bingham, what were you trying to do there with its promise of equality? And he said he sought a, quote, a simple, strong, plain declaration that equal laws and equal and exact justice shall hereafter be secured within every state of the Union, guaranteeing equal protection for any person, no matter whence he comes or how poor, how weak, how simple, no matter how friendless. And in that sense, it's Bingham once again restating the commitment of the Declaration of Independence to equality, in this case, for any person in the United States. So let's get back to Plessy. What happened there? Or should I pause there, Kerry? Or
yeah. I mean, there's a lot of questions coming in, but I want to jump from Plessy to Brown and then ask these great questions coming in about World War II and what goes on with internment camps, what's going on with Native Americans. Yeah. How many states had a vote for the 14th Amendment? And I think that's such a great question from Natalie. How many states had a vote for the 14th Amendment to get it passed? And then how did they get all the Southern states to vote for the 14th Amendment? Because that is like a two-part question, knowing that it's really hard to get some Southern states to agree to these amendments. How did they get that work done? So there's a whole bunch wrapped in there, but we can walk through these two and add those in as well.
So do you want me to respond to those questions or go to Plessy? I'm happy to do whichever.
Can you do the 14th Amendment? How did they get through first, and then go to Plessy, and then we'll weave in the other two after Plessy and Brown?
Sure. I mean, so how did they get it through? What Congress said is effectively, we have power over you Southern states. We're holding you out of the Union. If you want to come back in and be full and equal parts of the Union again after the Civil War, you have to do a bunch of things. This is from the Military Reconstruction Acts in 1867. You have to let African Americans vote. You have to write that into your state constitutions. And importantly, you have to ratify the 14th Amendment. So for these states to return to the Union, importantly for them to once again have representatives in Congress, they had to ratify the 14th Amendment. And so, there's a way in which, It's ratification at gunpoint. It's using the powers of the national government to say, this is what the Civil War was about. If you really want to come back into the Union, you have to recognize this result of the war. And so they counted the votes of the southern states, but in the end, they used the Reconstruction Acts, they used this power of Congress to hold the southern representatives out of Congress and then say, if you want to come back into the Union fully, you have to ratify the 14th Amendment. And the last thing I'll say, Kerry, because I just think it's such a cool part of the story, is remember, when you're ratifying the 14th, there's so many cool parts, but if you're ratifying the 14th and 15th Amendment, how does it get ratified? Well, what we're forcing them to do with the Reconstruction Act is African Americans have to be able to vote. So you have African American voters in these southern states, even before the 15th Amendment, which isn't ratified until 1870, voting on the ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendments. So in part, it's also organized African Americans organizing as a community to vote and voting in massive numbers to make sure that these amendments end up in the Constitution.
And that is, I think, the thing that catches everybody up, that you have this movement of African Americans changing the Constitution, but before the 15th Amendment. You think the 15th Amendment is when African American men get the right to vote, but that's not true. It happens before, and that's the guarantee in the Constitution. So things start to backslide. They start to go backwards with PLESSY v. Ferguson. And what is the court side? What is it? It's a split decision of, I'm going to say 8-1. Am I getting the numbers right? A split decision that says this behavior, separate but equal, is okay. How did they decide that? How did we have this kind of pullback of the 14th Amendment's ideas and values that were in there at the time? And it's only 20 years later.
Yeah, so you're right. There's only a lone dissenter. It's John Marshall Harlan, who we'll talk about in a second. But who wrote the majority opinion in Plessy? Well, it's Justice Henry Billings Brown. And who is Henry Billings Brown? Well, he was a mainstream Republican. He was an appointee of Benjamin Harrison, Republican Party being the party of Lincoln. Henry Billings Brown was born in Massachusetts. He went to Yale. He was a judge in Michigan. So we're not talking about some diehard ex-Confederate Southerner writing this opinion in Plessy v. Ferguson. We're talking about a majority that included many Republican appointed justices, a few Cleveland appointees as well. But what the court says is, you create this law separating white passengers for African-American passengers. This doesn't violate the 13th Amendment's abolition of slavery, doesn't violate the 14th Amendment's promise of equality. It's simply within the reasonable regulations that states can pass to promote the health, safety, and welfare of their citizens. It doesn't say anything explicitly, directly, clearly about African Americans being inferior. And what Justice Brown effectively says is, if that's what African Americans think about this law, that's on them. They don't have to look at it this way. The law itself, the written law, doesn't clearly discriminate. It just simply, it treats white passengers the same as African-American passengers. White passengers can't go to the African-American passenger car, and African-American passengers can't go to the white passenger car. Now, again, this attracts all but one vote on the Supreme Court. Who is the dissenter? Well, it's John Marshall Harlan. And if Henry Billings Brown was one, reminder that not all Northerners were for racial equality. By this point in time, very few of them were. What John Marshall Harlan shows is that previous biography doesn't necessarily predict what sort of justice you're going to be later in life. So he's a former slaveholder from Kentucky. He opposed Abraham Lincoln in 1860. For good measure, he opposed Abraham Lincoln again in 1864. He opposed the Emancipation Proclamation. He opposed the Reconstruction Amendments. But John Marshall Harlan changed. Reconstruction changed him. He saw the white violence against African Americans. He saw the lawlessness in the white South, how African Americans were being denied equality, both by violence and by the law, and he changed. And so he becomes the strongest voice in favor of strong protection in the Reconstruction Amendments of any justices of this period. He reads the promise of equality broadly in a way that becomes inspiring to later generations. He becomes the main proponent on the court that keeps alive incorporation. It's a series of opinions by John Marshall Harlan arguing that the 14th Amendment incorporates the Bill of Rights against the states, that Hugo Black picks up in the 20th century to do the incorporation revolution, and that later scholars like my mentor, Akhil Amar, Michael Kent Curtis, a bunch of other great scholars who pick up as arguments for why incorporation is consistent with the Constitution's text and history. And so what does Harlan say? Harlan says what surely we're all saying right now is, Justice Henry Billings Brown, are you out of your mind? How can you not look and see what Louisiana is doing here? Of course it's treating African Americans as second-class citizens. It doesn't matter what the law says just specifically. Look at it in context. Of course it's degrading. Of course it's humiliating. Of course it's a badge of slavery. And here's the famous language from Harlan that you hear people quote today. He said, in the eye of the law, there is in this country no superior dominant ruling class of citizens. There is no caste here. Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In my opinion, the judgment this day rendered will in time prove to be quite as pernicious as the decision made by this tribunal in the Dred Scott case. And so it was.
Awesome. Okay, we have like 80 great questions in the chat. So we're gonna move on really quickly to Brown v. Board of Ed, because I think it sets up what starts to change, what starts to legally change through the court system at this time. But Tom, we know that from Plessy v. Ferguson to Brown Board of Ed, there are people fighting every day in every way at the local level, the state level, and the national level to make change. There's court cases. One of my favorite court cases is the Morgan court case that fought about interstate commerce and segregated seats in a bus, and that was in the 1940s, and looked at how do you utilize the Commerce Clause to make change towards desegregation. So it's really fascinating, these brilliant strategies that were going on between these two big time periods. But can you kind of walk us through this moment and say, how did they finally put down what was going on, and separate would equal is okay, even though we all know it's not? Separate and equal clearly says somebody's below, somebody's above, and somebody's behind, even if they were equal, and we all know they were not equal. How does this change, and what kind of work happens to make this change? And then how does it affect kind of these other court cases that we're going to dive into? And then we're going to go to all these questions because they're great.
Okay, no, that's terrific. So obviously there's political movement, there's social movements, but I'll focus on legal strategy. So what happens? Well, the NAACP, especially under the leadership of Thurgood Marshall, brings a series of cases that chip away at Jim Crow segregation. And so Brown versus Board of Education is about desegregating public schools. But what the NAACP does first is they go after other forms of segregation in education. So they go against segregation in public universities. That's McLaurin versus Oklahoma. They go against segregation in law schools. That's Sweat versus Painter. And these cases then tee up Brown versus Board of Education. And so what does Thurgood Marshall argue? Well, he argues Plessy was wrong the day it was decided. It's inconsistent with the 14th Amendment's promise of equality. The court needs to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson, and that in the end, separate cannot be equal. Separate can, you can create two perfectly equal schools, but the separation itself is degrading and inconsistent with the Constitution's promise of equality. Of course, the schools were never equal anyway, but even suppose they were, separate is inherently unequal. And so Thurgood Marshall's arguments then meet a court that's led by Chief Justice Earl Warren. And what Thurgood Marshall said, and what Warren knew, was that not only must the NAACP win Brown to realize the promise of Brown versus Board, they have to secure a unanimous victory. You have to have all the justices speaking with a single voice. Only then will we stand a chance of blotting out segregation. And it's on Earl Warren as Chief Justice. He was the governor of California, a prominent Republican who does internal politicking on the court to make sure even those who are skeptical of some of the constitutional arguments in Brown, to get them on board, to sign on to a unanimous opinion written by Chief Justice Warren. And Chief Justice Warren writes a very simple, short opinion that he wants printed in newspapers throughout the country in full so everyone can see what the court's doing in very plain language. And what he just says is exactly what Thurgood Marshall argued. Separate but equal is inherently unequal in this context of education. And for Warren, part of it was there was sociological research from Kenneth Clark that suggested that African-American children who grow up in segregated schools have lower self-esteem, feel inferior, feel like second-class citizens, whereas those in integrated schools do not. And so part of that is you have to get the schools right if what you want to do is create a country that's truly committed to equality. And as we know, Kerry, it's not as though the Supreme Court just issued this opinion and that was the end of the story. You have a massive backlash from the South, including just about every Southern member of Congress, saying that Brown was wrong, that it's going at all of the traditional powers of the states. But over time, you see the civil rights movement build out from Brown, and then you see landmark civil rights laws passed by Congress in the 1960s, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so you see Congress now really, once again, for the first time since the height of Reconstruction, getting involved in promoting equality. You see the Warren Court as a partner in that mission saying, yes, what they are doing, what the Congress is doing with the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, it's consistent with the Constitution. It's realizing the promise of those Reconstruction amendments. And then we see the Warren Court once again get back in the action in 1967 in a case called Loving versus Virginia. And so this is a case dealing with the issue of interracial marriage. So this is Mildred Loving, Richard Loving. What's their crime under Virginia law? They love each other and they want to get married. And so we see these laws banning interracial marriage dating back to the 1800s. But in 1967, there's still 16 states that have these laws on the books. And what the Warren Court says is that, of course, these laws saying that a white person, an African-American, can't get married, of course, those laws banning interracial marriage are unconstitutional. They're inconsistent with the 14th Amendment's promise of equality. They're also inconsistent with the fundamental freedom, the fundamental right to marry. And so that's your story from Plessy to Brown to Loving v. Virginia. And if we bring it into 2015 and project forward, what happens, what becomes of Loving? It's one of the canonical cases in Supreme Court history. Well, we see the Supreme Court in 2015 ask the question, does Loving apply to bans on same-sex marriage? And so this is Obergefell versus Hodges, the 2015 case. And the Supreme Court divides 5-4. And it says that the majority, the 5-justice majority and a majority opinion written by Justice Anthony Kennedy says that same-sex marriage bans must go. They are unconstitutional. They violate the promise of equality. We know from Loving v. Virginia that the right to marry is a key fundamental right. And because of that, these must go. The dissent here, Kerry, all 4 of the dissenting justices each write separate opinions. I think the most, in a way, the most forceful opinion was by Chief Justice Roberts, his dissent, where he effectively makes a federalism argument. And he says, there's no clear text giving a right to marry or a right to same-sex marriage. This is a political debate that we've seen roiling about the country. Roberts himself admits that public opinion seems to be shifting in favor of LGBT couples. And so what he says is, in the end, the question comes down to who should decide this issue. And his conclusion was, we ought to let the debate continue, let the elected branches decide it, not the courts. So
Robert, well, yeah, good job. Robert's punting it back to the states, saying we need to let the states choose to do that. It's always interesting to see why the dissent said what they said. Okay, so here we're going to do this really quick. It's going to be the super speed round. A great question earlier in the group was the 14th Amendment violated in World War II when Japanese Americans had their citizenship stripped away in the internment camps? So real quick, because we have like 10 questions. Go, Tom.
Well, yeah, so it's certainly, yeah, I mean, so yes, I mean, I think based on sort of what you would take to be the general promise of the 14th Amendment, that's absolutely true. All those cases pit against each other, Kerry, are sort of the powers of the national government to keep the nation safe versus constitutional protections. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, second question in here, which I can't find again, but the general gist was, so the 14th Amendment, one of the key big features is to protection of freedom. So would you say, like Loving v. Virginia, is there protection of freedom to marry and choose who you want to marry? So the question was, how does it protect freedom?
That's a great question. So I would say Loving and Obergefell, if you read the two opinions, end up focusing, they're both equality and freedom working together. So it's the promise of equality is throwing out what the court would conclude as discriminatory laws, but it's also reaffirmed by a fundamental right to freedom. This goes into a huge rabbit hole of which rights are actually protected by the 14th Amendment. Is it the Bill of Rights? If it's the Bill of Rights, is it also rights that are not specifically written in the Constitution? And that's a whole different set of issues, whether, right to privacy or right to marry, et cetera, et cetera. But it's the 14th Amendment. That's the promise of freedom there.
Sammy's question from the beginning, and I promised Sammy that we would get it in here, was when trying to connect this to more current events, how would one respond to the backlash of Black Lives Matter protests versus the protests of Trump supporters? So what people have seen in the news where it looks like one group is being treated more aggressively than the others, could this be a 14th Amendment question and issue?
Yeah, I mean, it could potentially, you could bring claims either at, if it is people being treated differently, you could certainly bring a 14th Amendment equal protection claim. But furthermore, you can bring a 14th Amendment claim about freedom, about whether it's assembly rights, whether it's free speech, something like that. So again, that's a sort of case that could both be the equality, protection, and freedom.
Got it. Next one for you is, there's a lot of good questions here. Obergefell and v. Hodges, the case was on same-sex marriage, but was that the first one to reach the Supreme Court, or were there ones before that?
There were a few other, so a couple, I think it was 2013, there was a case called Hollingsworth versus Perry, which raised the same issue, and United States versus Windsor, which had to do with the constitutionality of Congress's Defense of Marriage Act, which was, the argument was that it discriminated against same-sex couples. But Obergefell is the one where the court decides the big issue, saying that same-sex marriage bans are unconstitutional. It punted the issue in Hollingsworth versus Perry, and then decides it 2 years later.
Got it. Good question. You always need to look at the precedent. What cases are leading up to it? And
yeah, there was even one, weirdly, there was one in the 1970s, which was a really short opinion where someone brought a similar claim that the court just dismissed in such a summary fashion. That one of the debates in Obergefell was, did we decide this issue in the 1970s or not? But anyway, yeah.
Question from Jason. How do states respond to Brown v. Board of Education? What actions do they take to limit the impacts of the court's decisions? And desegregating schools is really the biggest one. But what's the line again that the Warren Court said they needed to desegregate the schools?
All deliberate speed.
And I keep thinking it was haste is what I keep thinking in my head, like quickly, they meant quickly, but that's not really how it worked. I mean, when we think about desegregating schools, we think that Ruby Bridges was a 6-year-old and she was the first African-American child to desegregate a Southern elementary school. And that was only 60 years ago last week. So one might say it's not with utmost haste or with all deliberate speed. But what other ways did they have to take that action in schools? Where else, Tom?
Well, no, it ends up being this amazing, where you have Southern state legislatures and local communities doing everything from threatening and actually closing public schools, saying if you're going to desegregate our schools, we're going to close them, to using all sorts of different rules of zoning and everything else to try to keep as many students as possible separate. And so it ends up being a lot of federal courts swooping in and saying, no, you really have to take actions to desegregate the schools, and then the states pushing back. And so it's this friction between the states and the federal courts with then Congress coming in and threatening, well, if you don't desegregate, we're going to take away money. And so it's this dynamic, like this big debate, this big battle that's at the level of federalism and at the separation of powers.
Okay, last question, even though there's so many good ones in here. Cassandra asked, how has the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause affected racial discrimination in the United States overall? Such a good question. Wow. It's really hard. I know. It's like, whoa. But maybe we can end on where we can find out some of this, because like it's a great question. Like, are we tracking it? Are we seeing these? I mean, we're seeing change, but how are we tracking it over time? And you'll always see me do this in class, because when we look at freedoms, when we look at equality, when we look at rights, it's not just a perfect little arch to things getting better. It's more of unbelievable amount of energy and then pushback, and then energy and pushback by we the people fighting for change and using that power in the Constitution to make it work. So saying, Congress, you have the power, now do it. So Tom, how could you kind of measure that over time?
Very, very hard. I mean, I've heard Alan Gelzo, who's a great scholar, describe the Reconstruction Amendments as a zigzag, but there's a way in which you're right. The promise of the Reconstruction Amendments over time, it's going back and forth. I mean, I think one, I can recommend a book that'll take you into from PLESSY to the 1960s. It's Mike Klarman's From Jim Crow to Civil Rights, which won the Bancroft Prize. It's terrific. But I mean, I think broadly you can say it's done, especially from the civil rights movement onward, it's done quite a bit, both giving the courts the power to protect equality through people bringing lawsuits, but importantly also the courts making it clear that Congress has the power to pass civil rights laws that affect African Americans, women, people with disabilities, et cetera, et cetera. So it ends up being sort of both those things. And you know what? The Reconstruction framers would have loved that, because they wanted to write the protection of equality in two separate places in the 14th Amendment. This was one of the key debates as they were putting together the amendment, and they wanted a clause, and they wanted Section 1 as a freestanding part of the 14th Amendment to allow people to bring claims in court, and they wanted Section 5 in there empowering Congress to make sure Congress could also advance the cause of freedom and equality. Their concern Was, you know, maybe you'll have a court that's controlled by your enemies, which you saw with the 20 court, or maybe you would have a Congress that's controlled by your enemies, like when the white Southerners come back to power. So we want protections in both places.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. I hope you grabbed all of that. You guys were doing a really good job. I feel like somebody had a worksheet out there. They're like, wait, we got to get all these answers in. But awesome questions, amazing questions, great other questions about other court cases and bringing in other areas that you know in history. So we love you applying the big ideas that we're sharing and asking extra questions. So I appreciate this so much. It was a super fun class. On Friday at 1 o'clock Eastern time, we're going to dive in with Kate Mazur even deeper. And then next week, Jeff, thank you for asking this. Next week is a break week. So we are all off next week. Hopefully you are as well. Hi, Yolanda. Nice to see you out there. And then the week after that, we come back with Congress. So we're going to take an interesting look at Congress, how it was set up, how it's established, and how it works today. Join us for the Congress class. I find that the one where we all learn the most, because that is an area of our Constitution but I'm pretty sure none of us really know all that well. So come with us, learn with us. And thank you so much, Tom. This was a great class. Thanks for the speed round at the end.
That was so much fun. Thanks for all the questions. And thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Awesome to see you too. Yeah, such a fun, quick session. Jam it all in. It's like the 14th Amendment. It's packed full.
We could have, you know, we could have done it for another 2 hours of questions. I mean, there's just so much to talk about. You know what's really cool? You know, one thing to keep in mind, Kerry, about Kate on Friday is that she was one of the historians who helped lead the theme study on Reconstruction for the National Park Service. So that was part of the reason, so she thought a lot about how you tell this story to, you know, non-historians, to non-academics. And so has a lot of experience in that realm too, of public history.
Oh, that's amazing. I'm going to have to ask her about, we went to Alabama and the Park Service sites from Montgomery to Selma, we went to Selma, were some of the best interpretation sites I have ever seen in anywhere in the country. And they were Park Service sites, and they just really dived into it and told that story unbelievably well. We were all blown away. A bunch of nerdy museum people stopping in little tiny Park Service sites and like spending hours there. So I'm sure that's an interpretation across the country on Reconstruction, that it's not just in one place, that these stories are told over and over again. And today, like you said, last year, they're told again with court cases. So thank you so much, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording now. Lots of
Thank you, Brianne.